Picture hiding $32 trillion. Not in a vault, not in some numbered account on a snowy mountainside. In plain sight, wrapped in paperwork so dull that most governments simply stopped looking. One legal structure made it possible, and the bloke who perfected it changed how the ultra-wealthy make their money vanish without ever moving it. You've never heard his name. That's exactly the way he planned it. The structure is called a trust. Before your eyes glaze over, this thing is brilliant in the worst possible way. Trillions sit in places governments can't reach. One quiet lawyer built the whole system, and no matter how many investigations land, almost none of that money ever comes back. Not the word you use for a mate who always shows up, the legal entity. You own a fortune, houses, shares, cash, art, doesn't matter. You pour all of it into a trust. Legally, you no longer own a single thing. The trust does. You've just made yourself poor on paper while staying rich in every way that counts. Now here's the trick inside the trick. The trust is run by a trustee, a person or company you pick. Technically, they own everything now. But read the fine print. The trustee must follow your instructions. They can't sell, move, or spend a cent without your nod. You don't own it. You just control it, completely. Governments tax ownership. They have no idea what to do with control. Say you've got $50 million in shares. Own them directly and you're paying tax on dividends, capital gains, the lot. Now drop those shares into a trust. The trust owns them. The trust is registered somewhere that doesn't tax trusts. The dividends flow to the trust, not to you. As far as your home country can tell, you've got nothing. The wealth is still sitting there. It's just not yours anymore, on paper. And this is the part that makes it bulletproof. It's completely legal. You haven't broken a rule. You're using a structure courts have recognized for centuries. The second someone tries to challenge it, you've got 5 lawyers ready to wave 400 years of precedent in their face. Governments loathe it. They can't ban it without tearing up half their own legal system. So who worked out how to make this thing unbreakable? The bloke almost nobody can name. His name? You'll never find it. He saw to that. A lawyer, mid-20th century, working in a jurisdiction with just the right blend of British legal tradition and total indifference to where the money came from. He didn't invent the trust. Trusts go back to medieval England, dreamt up to keep family land out of the king's hands. What he did was take that ancient structure and rebuild it for the modern global economy. He stripped out the limits. He made it flexible, mobile, and nearly impossible to crack open. Here's what made him dangerous. He understood that rich people don't just want to hide money. They want control without ownership. They want to hand wealth down the generations without the taxman taking a bite every time someone dies. They want the money untouchable if they're sued, divorced, or investigated. This lawyer built one product that did all of it at once. His first big clients were old money families watching their fortunes get carved up by post-war taxes. He showed them how to shift everything into trusts based in places with no inheritance tax, no capital gains tax, and privacy laws that made Swiss banks look like gossips. Within a decade, some of the richest families on earth were on his books, and here's the move that turned it into an industry. He didn't set up one trust per client, he stacked them. A trust in one country controlling a trust in another, which owns a company in a third, which holds the actual assets. Now, anyone trying to follow the trail would need court orders across 4 jurisdictions, each with its own legal system and language. Most investigators just gave up. By the time he retired, the structure he'd perfected was the gold standard. Law firms around the world copied it. Whole jurisdictions built their economies around offering it. And the wealth that poured in, trillions, not a figure of speech, actual trillions. Now that number, $32 trillion. That's roughly the combined economies of the United States and China, just sitting there, hidden. Not one person's fortune. An estimate of the total stashed in offshore structures worldwide. Trusts, shell companies, foundations, the lot. And yes, the figure gets argued over. Some say higher, some say lower. But every serious estimate lands in the tens of trillions. Where is it physically? Mostly nowhere. Numbers and accounts. But legally, it's registered in a handful of small places: the British Virgin Islands, the Caymans, Jersey, Guernsey, Singapore, Switzerland. None of that is accidental. These places built entire legal systems designed to guard wealth and ask no questions. Here's how it plays out. You live in London. You've made a packet in property. You set up a trust in the British Virgin Islands. The trust owns a company in Guernsey. That company owns your London properties. You live in the house, you make every decision, but on paper you own nothing. The rent the company charges you is tax-deductible. The profits stay offshore, untaxed. When you die, nothing sits in your name, so there's no inheritance tax. Your kids take over control of the trust and the merry-go-round keeps spinning. Multiply that by a few 100,000 wealthy people and you start to see how 32 trillion quietly disappears. And here's the uncomfortable bit. Most of it isn't drug money or bribes. It's just rich people doing what rich people have always done, finding the gap between the rules and strolling through it. And honestly, the elegance of it bothers me more than the greed. This isn't a heist, it's architecture. The structure this lawyer perfected made the gap wide enough to fit a continent's worth of wealth. You'd think governments would just shut it down. They can't. Or more honestly, they won't. Because the same jurisdictions that hide wealth for foreigners also happen to be strategically handy, politically wired in, or too small to push around. Take the British Virgin Islands. It's a British overseas territory. The UK could close its offshore industry tomorrow if it wanted to. It doesn't. Why? Because the City of London feasts on the money that flows through these places. Lawyers, accountants, banks, they all take a slice. Crack down too hard offshore and you bleed onshore. Here's the bit that'll bend your head. The countries losing the most tax revenue are the same ones that wrote the laws making this legal. Britain built the legal framework. America shields the jurisdictions. They're not the victims, they're the architects. Then there's the legal trap. Even when governments do investigate, the trust is nearly impossible to break. If you can't prove someone owns something, you can't tax it, seize it, or freeze it. And the burden of proof sits with the government. They have to prove you're the real person behind it all, the beneficial owner in legal speak. Meanwhile, the documents say the trustee owns it, and the trustee is a company in a jurisdiction that shares nothing with anyone. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers. Those leaks laid the whole machine bare. Millions of documents, thousands of names. And how much did governments actually recover? A rounding error. Less than 1%. Because knowing the structure exists and proving someone broke the law are two completely different problems. And the final kicker. Even when a government wins a case, the wealth has usually slipped away before the ruling lands. Trusts can be restructured, relocated, or dissolved faster than any court can move. It's like trying to grab a fistful of smoke. So let's bring it home. $32 trillion sitting in structures built to dodge tax. That's roughly the combined economies of the United States and Japan. It's not circulating. It's not paying for schools, hospitals, or roads. It's just sitting there, compounding, waiting to be handed to the next generation who will never pay tax on it either. And here's the part that should sting. You're covering the difference. When the wealthy don't pay their share, governments don't just shrug and accept less. They shift the load. They lift income tax on wages. They trim public services. They borrow more and call it a deficit. You've been handed the bill for a $32 trillion hole. This isn't an angry political rant. It's just arithmetic. Tax revenue has to come from somewhere. If it's not coming from wealth tucked away in trusts, it's coming from you. And the wildest part? The structure behind all of it isn't some shadowy conspiracy. It's taught in law schools. It's advertised by wealth management firms. In the world of the ultra-rich, it's about as ordinary as a Tuesday. The only strange thing is that most people have no clue it exists. That lawyer who perfected the system died decades ago. His creation is stronger than ever. Every year, more wealth flows in. Every year, governments announce crackdowns that recover next to nothing. Every year, the gap between what the rich are worth and what they'll actually pay grows wider. You just watched $32 trillion disappear in 10 minutes. It's been happening in slow motion for 70 years, and the system isn't easing off. It's speeding up. Remember that lawyer? The one whose name never comes up? Dead for decades, and his fingerprints are still on every dollar of that 32 trillion. He built the machine, walked away, and left the rest of us paying for it. That's the real trick. You don't need to hide. You just need to build something so boring, so smothered in legal paperwork, that nobody bothers to look. If this made you see money a little differently, there's a playlist right there pulling apart every other trick the system runs on. You've already found the gap. Might as well see how deep it goes. That's money, actually.